If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Wraith the Oblivion 1st Edition. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the game for you. When reviewing books on the channel, it should be obvious by now that I only review things I have used in games or this channel in some capacity. If it's a core book, I have to run it first, as it's one thing to read whether a system works well, and another to see how well it works in a game. With tonight's book, Wraith the Oblivion 1st Edition, I'm breaking that rule because fuck traditions. If you've run 20th anniversary, you've technically run 2nd and definitely 1st. And if I don't break this rule, I am never going to vent about Wraith the Oblivion 1st Edition, and I really want to vent away at it. But before we get on to that, here are the rules for the Lore by Night book reviews. I shall explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong and vice versa. A good place to start, if anything, is at the beginning, which has a start of the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book, made out of that slightly squishy cardboard material, meaning this drive-through RPG copy will mark easily. That said, mine is currently free from such creases, despite the countless times I've read through this book, and even if it did mark it in this manner, that would not bother me too much, but I know that sort of thing will annoy people. My solution to this is purchase a PDF copy. I make this point to highlight my copy as a print-on-demand copy for two reasons. Firstly, the original print of Wraith the Oblivion 1st Edition was never made available in a hardcover format, only softcover. Second, and this is perhaps the most important reason, the original front cover of Wraith the Oblivion 1st Edition had a glow-in-the-dark title, which is a very fun 90s inclusion. All it needed was a scratch-and-sniff feature that smelt like unwashed feet of death more than the cheese would have it be completed. So let's talk about the front cover itself. We have those metallic chains around what I can only presume is a blue painted wall, with the crest of the Stygia placed neatly upon them. The chains carry over to the back cover of the book, as with the key of Stygia placed roughly in the same space, with an evocative blurb describing this storytelling game of death and damnation. It's all very bleak, but there are glimmers of hope in the writing too, which gives something for players to fight for, something that I think isn't so present with the other World of Darkness games, particularly when we pair Wraith the Oblivion 1st Edition up with the 1st Edition games of Mage, Werewolf and Vampire, where there isn't really hope at all, just weak optimism at best. When I say that the presentation and artwork for this core book is perfect, I mean that wholeheartedly. The book captures a whole host of emotions to define what Wraith the Oblivion is from a glance without reading any of the material within. We have the very creepy, twisted frames and glyphs of John Cobb, as well as his own twisted machinations that crawl like monstrous slime, bug-eyed and spindly digits that point out for the subheading, the 90s gothic punk, early White Wolf established too, with double-page spreads by Tim Bradstreet, the varied works of Josh Timbrook capturing the lonely, dying and outright monstrous, with pieces in between that resonate deeply with me on a profoundly deep level. There is not a single piece in here that I don't like, and it's honestly painfully difficult trying to work out which ones are my favourites. If I were to limit myself to 5, I'm absolutely smitten with the art pieces found on pages 24, 75, 159, 236, and 239. I only have two things to complain about regarding its overall presentation. The first is mostly petty, and it's the quality of the scan of my print-on-demand version of Drive-Thru RPG isn't fantastic, but it is pretty readable all the same. You may have a better time with the PDF, which leads me on to the second point. The book proper starts starts with a prelude describing what a Wraith is, the Shadow, the Shadowland, and the other basics that are likely to come up when describing Wraith to someone for the first time to someone. The section is delivered not quite in character, but it's informal, like someone's personal guide to the underworld. It definitely hits the gothic moody vibes for Saw, far more so than its older siblings within the World of Darkness, as it harbours much more so on the fact that you are dead and the world you are once a part of will move on without you. But there are snippets of hope to be found, though the near mythical state of transcendence, but what you are able to achieve from beyond the Shroud and moving forward a familiar yet totally alien society within the Shadowlands. My gripes with it is with regards to the presentation is a similar issue I find with other White Wolf core books centered around the 2nd edition rule set, and that the black text on the grey background is only great in terms of moody aesthetic. In terms of accessibility, it sucks donkey dick through a clogged up straw. Something worth mentioning with that prelude is just how its tone is ultimately frightened people off, because the larger World of Darkness fanbase are incapable of realising the similarities between the games before it and Wraith. Wraith just happens to bear its darkness on its sleeve. Once you have read those opening pages and decided to actually give Wraith the Oblivion a shot, you are greeted with a standard World of Darkness introductory chapter that details what it aims to cover and what you'll find inside. This chapter, Chapter 1, starts by highlighting a very simple yet effective fact that the human race has told ghost stories for hundreds of years, perhaps longer than the tales of vampires, werewolves, and witches. Restless spirits, spiritual gods, and the like have been the bedrock of the morals of countless fire stories, and Wraith of the Oblivion aims to be no different in that sense. Where it does differ, of course, is that a group of you, fewer than 6 to use the book's recommendations, will be playing and portraying the ghosts. It goes on in the manner you would expect, telling the reader what a storytelling game is, what role-playing is, and the basics do's and don'ts of transitioning the dice-centric game to live-action roleplay, or LARP, which is a weird inclusion looking back just because of the existence of Mind's Eye Theatre version of Wraith, Oblivion, which definitely isn't confusing at all. The chapter ends in a similarly predictable fashion, with the bare-bones basics of Wraiths, including their basic abilities, their death and life sight, heightened sense, and insubstantiability, which I can never say properly, so go and cope if that upsets you, the Shadow, the Shadowlands, and Transcendence, as the developers probably assumed most people were going to skip over the prelude and just get stuck into the book. We also have a lexicon of common, not so common, and vulgar parlance you will hear in the Shadowlands, and a little paragraph informing the players, but more so to the storyteller, not to go gentle, which, when you read it, is more do not go light on the topics and embrace it. It's something I have appreciated of all the White Wolf games, as it helps to establish the society of its supernatural denizens within this snippet of the World of Darkness. It's particularly important with Wraith, I think, as it is the only game within the World of Darkness that spends most of its time in a different plane of existence, which moves on to the second chapter of the book, which we learn more about the setting of Wraith the Oblivion, starting with the all-familiar gothic punk world of living, combining the dark, romantic, and macabre elements of goth with the rebellious DIY and anti-establishment attitude of punk, though Wraith definitely leans more into the gothic part of that statement. By default, I'd assume that most Wraiths are against staging customs of slavery and melting down your common man into weapons, building materials, coin, and furniture for the elite, which is how this chapter probably starts discussing its setting, which is a pretty fucking bleak start, but it highlights the punk elements as well as the stagnating path that Wraiths live by and the desperation they tolerate, lest they get torn apart by merciless forces of Oblivion, which we do learn more about here, in addition to the Tempests, Nihils, the Far Shores, and the rest of the underworld that was conceptualized at this point. So very little of the other Dark Kingdoms can be found here, if at all. One thing I think this book does much better when compared to the next 2 editions of this game is defining what haunts are and giving some players something to fight for in the underworld beyond that, by giving them domains or turfs. It's a very simple but recognisable world building for newer players to latch onto, but also puts the much needed spectral twist on things, making them beyond a ghost home. The history of the underworld is defined here as well, contributing this being one of the beefier chapters of the book, and not really something I recommend newer players reading picking up any edition of Wraith for the first time, and placing this material so close to the beginning is a bit odd to me, as it creates the impression that players have to learn centuries of fictional history, lore, and metaplot, and even with this book being a fraction of WR20 size, it's still a lot to digest. That said, what is presented here is filled with such moody poise that it really does sell the danger of the underworld, as well as the tragedy that Wraith the Oblivion runs on. I mentioned it on more detail on my review of the 20th anniversary edition, and it's much superior writing here and more engaging, once again taking the character to reader approach, this time in the form of a letter, a rarity in the underworld. The rest of the chapter is spent talking about the general Western Wraith society, from social status, possessions and trade, artifacts, guilds, and the main players in the Dark Kingdoms of Iron, the Hierarchy, Renegades, and Heretics, all of which will be expanded in future sourcebooks, before ending on bits of information on the Ferrymen and Spectres, who would also get their own dedicated sourcebooks, bookending the original run of Wraith the Oblivion. I'm being brief here because the information here is a great summary for surface level entry, but it's information that has been expanded a lot more on this channel and the official books that followed this core book, so I wish not to waste my time retreading on familiar ground. Chapter 3, oddly enough, is the storytelling chapter, which is another weird choice that was common with the second edition core books. It's a lot of page flipping for players who have no interest in running the game so they can get to the character creation stuff and all that fun crunchy stuff, but I think the logic behind this is that it emphasizes that Wraith the Oblivion, like all the World of Darkness games, are collaborative storytelling games that put the combat on the back burner most of the time, which probably is why it's called the storytelling system, and this chapter is called storytelling. But how fares this chapter? Well, I'm pleased to report it's a bloody fine chapter. It is very similar to the 20th anniversary edition chapter on storytelling, which different themes and emotions are brought up and how they can be applied to a game, but first edition not only goes into greater detail with said emotions providing more, but each emotion has plenty of themes behind them with example stories ideas that anyone can run wild with. This continues as the chapter aids to the budding storyteller how to put together their story and chronicle, including snippets on crossplay, which is really cool to me, which is far more creative than the usual playable scenario at the back of the book idea, which Wraith doesn't include but does have a mini setting based in Atlanta, which is also mentioned in Necropolis Atlanta, which is also really fucking cool. If you haven't checked out my review of that book, you definitely should. It's totes based. And whilst not at the end of the chapter, there's a chunky box on page 77 I wish to highlight, just because I'm feeling antagonistic and fancy pissing on some dickheads, titled The Nature of Fear. It highlights the importance of communication between players and the storyteller, ensuring that fear remains fun rather than distressing. Players should establish ways to express discomfort if the game pushes their boundaries. A consent-based approach allows for immersive storytelling without causing real distress. That fear in role-playing should always be consensual and respectful of individual limits. Why, this sounds like consent in gaming? In 1994? Good lords above! The fourth chapter is short on the basics of the storyteller system and rolling d10s, which I don't think needs explaining, so I'll move on to chapter 5, which is the chapter most of you have been waiting for: character creation! Whilst the nuts and bolts will feel similar to those who have played 20th anniversary edition, as it's completely identical to the iteration of that game, there is one slight difference that it's writing that I really appreciate, or rather, the direction it took. The concepts are noticeably more helpful for an inexperienced player. Rather than posing questions, there are examples. Whilst there is nothing wrong with that, as I have praised that sort of engagement in books before, these short, brief ideas are clear-cut and straight to the point, serving as a good leaping-off point for any character creation. Life, death, and regrets don't have 10 examples for each, so it is quite straightforward to knock off concepts if you don't like one or don't have much use for it and roll a d10 for them. The questions and answers part are presented at the end of each chapter, which is worded to expand the character's backstory, if someone hasn't done so already, giving life to those dots. Oh, and specialties work differently here too. Chapter 6 is the traits chapter, which has all the information for all the bits and pieces on your character sheet. Again, the same shit that you're all used to with the World of Darkness games, though the main thing I wish to highlight here is that every background description is much easier to understand than the information in WR20. It paints a clearer picture, and you have a resources background called Wealth, with a table of the opali and what everything is worth. WR20 puts a lot of emphasis on the soul-forging element, games, and yet there is very little mention of the money of the fucking underworld. The silly cunts. If you have also been confused with WR20 with a health tracker you're supposed to knock off, read the corpus section on page 135 of 1st edition. Similar comments are also said with fetus, passions and pathos, the former two causing lots of confusion, I feel, with people looking to get into Wraith, particularly if they are coming over from Vampire, and I feel the way they are all described here is easier to understand. You have example of passions and emotions to go with them. Whilst WR20 has some, it is incredibly lackluster. Again, not going to go too much detail on this because it has been done to death on this channel already. Yes, that pun was intentional. The chapter concludes with the Arcanoi and how they work, as well as the guilds that, in 1st edition, are very much out of the picture. Mythical groups of Wraith that developed these powers, but definitely do not exist anymore. I feel this is the only book that makes it 100% certain that all Wraiths have Arcanoi, not just the guild Wraiths. And if it isn't, then fuck me, I guess. Though, I can definitely say that this book has the clearest presentation of the Arcanoi across the 3 editions of Wraith, whereas 2nd and 20 have given you the guild names first, then the Arcanoi. We only get to the Arcanoi name here, though the guild name does appear later within their respective Arcanoi sub-chapters, placing the emphasis not on the guild, but on your guildless Wraith first. It's such a beautiful feeling not having to pen through literally hundreds of pages to find the one power you want, because it is confusingly laid out. The other main difference when compared to WR20 at least, is that there are no initiate arts, only the 5 powers plus 3 basic abilities that are optional, really giving the Wraith up to 8 powers with a single power, which is monkey's bananas. The following chapter is all about the shadow, which, like the character creation material in chapter 5, it is pretty similar to how you would make a shadow concept in WR20, albeit with less archetypes, but as they are not mechanical, you can easily port them over or use the ones from the players and shadow guides for 1st edition, which I also reviewed on the channel recently. Its biggest departure when compared to the other 2 Wraith core books is the presentation of Harrings, a personal torture theatre focused around passions and fetters, which are probably the main thing that many Wraiths fear. It is an important part of Wraith, helping the character come to terms with what they have lost, but also to take care of these things, assuming that they have been ignored. Harrings can also kill the character, which does add a notable point of importance. When Harrings differ when compared to the other 2 is the presentation and the lack of rules. I am reminded almost of how effects are presented in the Chronicles of Darkness, where you're not always presented with the role that you need to do, but you are told what happens with a success, failure, and botch. I say almost because the outcome is result of a passion or fetter roll at a difficulty 8, that is the extent of it. There are no different types of harrowing, just a harrowing with different ways of succumbing to one. Each archetype has their own example harrowing to use as a template, and you are told how to structure a harrowing from the beginning, middle, to end as an important bit of roleplay, but it lacks a lot of the information and discussion present in its latter iterations, and I'm unsure what to make of this. On the one hand, I have no problem understanding the ins and outs of harrowings when I first read them in WR20, but I also feel I had enough reading 1st edition, but I'm also an experienced games master. Perhaps the latter Wraith editions were bloated out for bloating out's sake? I cannot tell. The next chapter, chapter 8, has the systems, which is basically experience, the different ways your character can get hurt, both physical and supernatural, achieve transcendence, and a curious little box about how characters can change their personality via the nature and demeanour through roleplay, which is not something I can recall seeing in many other World of Darkness books. It's curious seeing it in Wraith, given what they are, but they are beings of pure emotion. I suppose it makes more sense here than any of the other splats of darkness. Chapter 9 carries on with the predictable with the drama, which really should have been with the systems or rules, as is all the combat and weapon shit, but I've come to accept this with White Wolf products, so I can't complain too much here, as it's the same shit you find in Vampire and any other World of Darkness game, minus the race-specific stats of being. I shan't bash about this chapter here, that is, except for the example of play, which is something I typically ignore in my book reviews, but this one caught my eye for 2 reasons. First, the section is divided into 2, the narrative and the session itself, and some footnotes on the right on the corresponding page, which makes digesting the information a lot easier than the comic book approach White Wolf and, bizarrely, Wraith the Oblivion 2nd edition has. Secondly, it has a circle with a group of Wraiths with different allegiances. Some are pro-hierarchy, whilst others are some are heretics. It's a formation that would make more difficult to pull off in other World of Darkness games, but Wraith encourages that way of thinking here, and technically speaking, if your character wishes to resolve their fetters, they are heretics. To conclude the book, we have an appendix, a whole mishmash of miscellaneous shit, from sample artifacts, enemies, supernatural denizens of the night, with funny uses of Arcanoi in place of their actual powers and mortal foes, as well as more spectres, including a means of creating them for NPCs. There is also a setting I mentioned earlier, Little 5 Points, which is a lot more expansive than I was expecting when I read it, given how bare bones the ones of older editions of Vampire the Masquerade were, rivaling more than well for the Apocalypse Central Park. That said, that is a setting that does benefit a lot of owning Necropolis Atlanta to make full use of it, which does have its inherent problems which I talked about in the review of it, but you certainly don't feel limited without it. There's plenty to work with, including statted out characters and adventure ideas. Wraith the Oblivion concludes with an in-game chant of the guilds, which is the closest we will ever get to a Wraith the Book of Nod or the Silver Accord, and heartfelt last words from Mark Rein-Hagen, creator of the various World of Darkness games we love and loathe so much. I'm genuinely unsure how well this is all coming across, but my love for this book is purely unmatched. Wraith the Oblivion is my favourite tabletop role-playing game of all time, and this iteration, the original, raw version of the game, is perhaps the most best in terms of gothic romantic writing and presentation across all the World of Darkness books. Yeah, the powers are a bit unbalanced in having the most important element of the game, the harrowing, left to as much interpretation as it is written, is not the best idea in the world, but they'd get tweaked in future books. The Shadow Player's Guide would provide a lot more information on how to experience harrowings, which isn't an ideal fix, yes, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. But to address a noticeable elephant in the room, why am I so eager to review this book when it's highly unlikely I ever run or play this edition of Wraith the Oblivion? I personally think I have made it clear with this review I presented to you, but there is a lot in this edition of Wraith that is greatly missed in the following editions and discussion, and I think that is just sad. Anyone who is wanting to get into Wraith should purchase a copy of this book, preferably from wherever and however is cheapest for you, providing it is done legally, and use it as a beautiful tool for a beautiful game. That said, if you don't like or just put off by the chunky 20th anniversary edition of this game and want a gentler start into Wraith the Oblivion, you can't go wrong with this edition. And for those of you who are new to the Law by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book The Armies of Darkness out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Law by Night VTM Instagram and Blue Sky pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.